But getting back to getting groups together, one of the findings that's come out is that it's not just interaction, but it has to be equal status interaction.
Yeah.
If you bring people together in groups, but the status of one group is still much higher than the other, then both groups are going to feel antagonism. The group that is of the lower status is going to find that they're treated in a demeaning fashion, and the group of the higher status, it will confirm to them that they are superior. So you have to do something in advance to make sure that they're coming in as equals and that they're working on a similar project in order for interaction to be effective. Okay, another theory, and this goes back a long time ago. I guess it was in 1950s. A fellow by the name of Muzafer Sharif at the University of Oklahoma created a theory called realistic conflict theory. And the way he did that is by having groups of kids go to a residential summer camp. They were each in different bunks, and he would have the bunks have competitions with each other in order to win a prize, whatever the prize was on that day. But they were always constantly competing. And he found that competition would lead to prejudice almost immediately. The counselors in the bunks were his own graduate students at the University of Oklahoma, and they would be secretly recording what the kids would say. The kids would come back from the baseball field or from whatever the competition was, and they would talk about the people in the other bunks, both in terms of stereotypes. Oh, they're all blankety blank, whatever terms they would use. They would express hatred towards the members of the other group. And in many cases, they would engage in actually violent behaviors. They would gang up on members of the other bunks and raid them, try to beat them up or whatever. Now, obviously, nowadays, ethically, we wouldn't be able to do that sort of thing, even for a day. But after a couple of days, what happened was that Sharif stopped the competitions across the bunks. And he created situations where the bunks had to all work together for a superordinate goal to achieve something that they all needed in common. For example, one day the kids woke up and there was no water in any of the bunks. And they were told the water line burst and they'd have to all work together to tow in a water tanker. Or they'd have to all work together to find the broken pipe or whatever. And by having them work together for a goal that they all would benefit everybody, what he found is that pretty soon the kids were friendly with each other. And the grad students in the bunks were saying how the kids would come back and say, gee, I met so-and-so, a really nice kid. I'm going to try to eat with that kid from the other bunk in the mess hall. Now, it's not just 10-year-old kids. We have many, many examples based on Sharif's research that this holds up in the real world too.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like something that what was it? Oh, evolutionary psychology. One criticism of evolutionary psychology that is kind of broad is that you can apply evolutionary psychology to anything and say that, oh, this evolved to benefit humans in one way, but it might also conflict with another theory. So it's like humans are made to cooperate, right? Because it's an evolutionary advantage that they cooperate, but then it's also an evolutionary advantage that they compete. So it's kind of like they're conflicting, but maybe that's the truth. Maybe we have evolved to compete and also cooperate, and maybe that's what we're kind of seeing here.
You hit it right on the nose in terms of the inability to create experiments. You can do experiments on fruit flies very nicely, but doing experiments where you take people with different genes and try to cross-mate them and see what happens. It's everything that evolutionary psychology posits is really post hoc. It's after the fact. You see a particular behavior, and then you just name it. And you say this is adaptive. And as you point out, you could argue that any particular behavior is adaptive in terms of enhancing the gene pool. So, not one of my favorite theories. The other reason why evolutionary psych theory is not one of my favorite theories is that essentially it says that whatever we find that's the way it's always going to be.
Yeah.
It's a very pessimistic theory, sociobiology.
Interesting.
Okay, but there is another groovy theory
Yeah.
that is although it's been around for like 25 years, it's really getting a lot of press in the last couple of years. It's called terror management theory.
I've heard of that one.
TMT is the abbreviation for it. What terror management theory posits is that we are all scared of death. And we don't have to express that fear, specifically, but anything that reminds us, even if we don't realize that it's being presented to us, such as if you ask people to come into a laboratory on a verbal learning experiment, you give them lists of words to remember later, but some of the words include things like cemetery or corpse or whatever. You're going to create unconsciously a fear of one's own mortality. And what research has shown is that when you create that fear of one's own mortality, people tend to get more conservative. They try to enhance their own group. They try to do things that put down other groups. They become more aggressive and punitive towards whoever they can victimize. They become more intolerant to outgroups. And it's not, although this research has only been around for the last 25 years, politicians, going even back to Machiavelli, have known that if you create a fear campaign, if you get people to be frightened about their own mortality, what will happen is that they will become willing to fight for their own group against any outgroup that's out there. They'll identify more with their own nation. It's a way of enhancing our sociobiologists, the evolutionary psychologists would claim it's a way of enhancing the contributions of our own gene pool. But we don't really know why this happens, but we know that fear campaigns always work in terms of, fear of your own mortality. If someone will tell us that the people coming across the borders, the refugees coming across the borders are rapists and murderers, what will happen is that we are going to look for a strong leader. We're going to try to enhance our own in-group.
Right.
It's, it's an interesting theory, and it's finding more and more support in terms of now with the pandemic, with people being fearful about their, again, own mortality, knowing people who have died, all of a sudden they become much more conservative politically.
That's so interesting, because I'm wondering, I'm like trying to connect things in my head, because first of all, I don't have a problem with like the conservative mind at all. I mean, I was reading about like neuroscience about liberal and conservative, and like I actually, like, I have, it's surprising, but like I'm a very progressive individual, but I do have some kind of more open-minded conservative friends. But it's my understanding that during the pandemic, in the United States, it was more like, I guess, right-wing tendencies that seemed to be the most who wanted to refute the evidence of the severity of the pandemic, which is ironic, because you're saying that it is due to the fear of death that we become more conservative. But in that case, in the case of the pandemic, it was like kind of the opposite. Like the conservatives became the most, the least fearful. I'm wondering if there's
why would that be? Why should that be? Why would they deny it? Well, that leads us to the next theory, which deals with the prejudiced personality, the authoritarian personality. And one of the components that you're going to see when we talk about the authoritarian personality is a tendency to deny science.
Yeah, that one is strange to me. Or what about denying science, but also like reformulating it so that it suits your needs. Like the Nazi experiments, Unit 731, these like the Axis powers and their scientific motives, or the racial ideology of the Nazi Party. This seems to be like you will have scientists in your ranks, but that becomes subsumed under the ideology itself.
Yeah.
So maybe,
I mean, Hitler could not deny science. Germany was perhaps the major scientific nation of its time.
Yeah.
However, the inhuman things that were done to the lesser races, all of the experimentation that was done, gruesome things, but it was in the name of science that will better our race.
Yeah, exactly. But like, no, you're also right. It's like, maybe I'm trying to like synthesize the authoritarian personality aspect of that, which is that it could be that anti-scientific thinking might work on a general populace level, but like in the regime itself, there will be like, scientists and thing like that, but just an observation.
Yeah, well, I mean, Hitler had a medical corps. Mengele, who was responsible for a lot of the most inhumane experiments, looking at ways people were able to tolerate pain until death, that sort of thing. And he did it in the name of science. So, science can be terribly unethical, tremendously unethical. And, some of the books that illustrate the Human Atlas were derived by German medical researchers dissecting human beings, dissecting Jews for the most part, to illustrate the medical atlas.
Does the authoritarian personality contain a trait that has to do with, I guess, like dehumanization?
Well, that can lead to dehumanization.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me give you a little background into the authoritarian personality. And
sure, yeah.
That will be the last theory that I do cover
yeah.
theories that try to explain anti-Semitism. This was a research, an extensive piece of research that was done at the University of California at Berkeley in the late 1940s. And its goal was to try to find out after the Holocaust whether such a thing could ever happen in the United States. Is it possible that people from a free democratic country like the US could ever adopt the policies of a Hitler? And so what the researchers at Berkeley did is they started off to find out what's the level of anti-Semitism they used the population on the West Coast of non-minority members, all whites, non-minorities, and they administered a scale of anti-Semitism that they developed, and they sure enough found that there was a full range of people who were strongly anti-Semitic and people who were not anti-Semitic. They then asked the question, are these people just prejudiced against Jews, or are their prejudices generalized to all minorities? And so they developed a second scale called the Ethnocentrism scale, administered to them, same groups, and they found very, very high correlations. If you're anti-Semitic, you tended to hate all groups, all minority groups. And in fact, they even threw in a fictitious group, and they found that people hated the fictitious group just as much as they hated the real groups. And those who were low in anti-Semitism were low in ethnocentrism. They then, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, it's just that in my research, I've never seen like these two things not be together. Like they're just ethnocentrism, anti-Semitism. Like, although, like, again, it's like, it is kind of a scale in which I think, in my experience, in the American experience, your garden variety racism is far more common than anti-Semitism. Now, that's just according to my understanding of things. Could have been different in the past, but it seems to be that, like, racism is like a very broad area in which many people fall, but then you could easily cross the line into more. And anti-Semitism seems to be a more like advanced stage, I guess, of this whole thing. I don't know how to.
It depends on the area where you're from. You're on the East Coast, you're in a college environment, and you're going to find that more educated people have had an opportunity to deal with more Jewish people, and the level of anti-Semitism, a knowledge of the Holocaust is stronger in the type of groups that you interact with. On the other hand, if you go down to the Deep South, where people don't know that many Jews, their beliefs about Jews and Blacks and brown people, they will merge together as far as they're concerned.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Like, my own thinking is being influenced by like a kind of regional view of things. Wow. So, are you? Oh, keep going.
Okay, so just to continue on with how the authoritarianism research went on. What happened was that after giving the ethnocentrism scale, they said, well, are there a constellation of other political attitudes that these people have in common? And so they developed a scale called the political economic conservatism scale, in terms of people's belief that the government should not be involved in any social welfare policies, that there should be strong authoritarian, repressive leaders. And sure enough, the people who are anti-Semitic and ethnocentric tended to be very right-wing conservatives. The people who are low in the form of prejudice tended to reject the political economic conservatism scale. Now, please, as you said, people who are conservative politically, but who are, not prejudiced individuals who are, reasonable thinking people. That doesn't mean to say that when we find a correlation, doesn't mean to say that every conservative is a bigot, not by any stretch of the imagination, but that the items do correlate. At least they found that with the West Coast non-minority population that they studied. Okay. Having done that and seeing that there's this constellation of attitudes that hang together, prejudice and a conservative right-wing ideology, they asked what makes people prone to this. And so they invited the participants, both the high scores on those three scales and the low scores on those three scales, to have interviews with psychiatrists who were trained in Freudian psychodynamics, the belief that our unconscious propels a lot of our actions and our beliefs and our values. They weren't told that the Freudians are going to try to get into their head and find out why they're bigots or why they're not bigots. They were told this is a health interview. And what the Freudians were looking at was their recollections of their early childhood upbringing, whether their parents used physical punishment, what threats were used to handle discipline in the home, what were the concerns and worries, what were the attitudes towards sexuality, which is a very big thing in Freudian psychology. And based on the interviews, the psychiatrists and the researchers, the social psychologists and the economics, political scientists, Theodore Adorno, who led this, was a political scientist.
Adorno,
who put this together, pulled out a number of traits or components that they felt led to an authoritarian personality, a personality that could easily come under the rule of a fascist leader. In fact, they called the scale the Fscale, or potentiality for fascism scale. It was based on 9 components.
Yeah, which I read about the Fscale. It's also referred to as like the California scale.
California
Okay.
California scale of authoritarianism, but everybody refers to it in the field as the F scale.
Okay. Yeah. So that actually is our next point. Let me just, what does it actually say? Oh, okay. Yeah, it was Theodore Adorno in 1947. And so there are versions of the F-scale test available online. Now, 31 I found is 30 questions. I don't know, it's like around 30 questions, I suppose?
Yeah, the original had 38 questions in it.
Oh, okay.
And then over the course of time, it's been changed, it's been adapted.
Right.
Yep.
So I guess the F scale is really interesting. There is, and also Theodore Adorno is a really interesting person as well. He was like this like brilliant man who was into sociology, psychology, music, art, philosophy. He was like very, I mean, for his time, like a very liberal thinker. So he's just an interesting person himself.
Yeah.
But the F scale has some criticism that I haven't seen about the other scales, like the anti-Semitism scale. Or one is that it says the criticism is actually just as interesting as the actual scale. It fails to predict all aspects of an authoritarian personality, and that it may be a better indicator of conservatism or even an old-fashioned outlook. I think for this, the one I found seems to be like the first version of the F-scale test. And it does indeed seem to be very of its time. Like the questions kind of reflect the views of probably someone born in the first half of the 20th century. But then some other questions are actually more like universal. So the F-scale test itself is like the questions are geared towards is this what you would call a Likert scale?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
a lot of the questions are
the original though was a true false scale.
Oh,
and then
okay.
later adaptions have you put into a Likert format. There have been loads of changes in the attempt to try to create a scale to measure proneness towards prejudice, a prejudiced personality, without regard to whether one is right wing or one is a radical socialist.
Right. Yeah. But I find it interesting that like it could be possible that it indicates conservatism more, but like conservatism itself seems to take a pretty common form. I mean, isn't in the term itself, conservatism just means to conserve.
Right.
So it's going to always reflect, it seems to me that like conservatism always reflects a desire for the world to be as it once was.
That is the term, that there are certain basic values that a conservative believes in that they don't necessarily have to be harmful or prejudiced values, but values that we have to maintain a pride in our heritage. We have to maintain the status quo against potential changes that might disrupt society, and that the laws should support our patriotism and that sort of thing. But when it's overdone, when it's done to the extreme, and when one supports it and supports the idea as one of the components of the F scale, authoritarian aggression, that we should all support a leader who can repress people's civil rights, who can force people to bow allegiance, and we can make all types of statements about outgroups, that sort of thing. It leads to fascism.
Right.
But let me just say, that doesn't mean to say that we don't have terrible examples on the other side of communist leaders
Yeah,
who've done
authoritarian.
horrendous things in China, the Uyghurs, the way they're currently treated, or the Buddhists in Tibet,
Yeah,
which Tibet is no longer a free nation.
yeah,
What Stalin did in terms of starving the people in the Ukraine in the 1930s, so there are authoritarian leaders on both sides of this political spectrum who engage in atrocities.